A single drop of water falls in the dark. It does not fall far. It pulls away from the surface of a wall of ice, from the gray underside of a rime shelf, hanging in the absolute cold of the primordial void, and it falls perhaps an inch before it strikes the frozen ground below. The sound it makes is small and specific, a soft tick against the silence, and then the silence comes back completely, the way silence does in very cold and very empty places, sealing over the sound as though it had never been made at all. This is Gunungap. This is the void that the Norse tradition holds existed before anything else, before the earth, before the sky, before any being capable of noticing the cold. The word itself carries the sense of a gap or a gulf, a charged opening between things, and the oldest sources describe it not as pure nothingness, but as a space positioned between two enormous and opposing extremes, holding between them the particular tension of things that have not yet resolved into anything recognizable. On one side, to the north, there is a world of darkness and ice, on the other, to the south, a world of fire, and between them this, the long, cold, still, and extraordinary interval where nothing has yet been named. The Prose Edda, the 13th century Icelandic compilation in which the Norse cosmological tradition survives in its most complete form, describes these primordial conditions in the section called Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi, where the cosmology is set out in the form of questions and answers, a scholar king interrogating figures of wisdom about the nature of the world. It is through this framing that Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic scholar and chieftain who compiled the Prose Edda, preserved what had by then become an old and fragmentary tradition, assembling from poems and oral accounts a sequence of events that explains how the cosmos came to be shaped the way it is. The account begins where all creation must begin, in the conditions that existed before creation, when there was nothing to observe and nothing capable of observation, and the void held only the preconditions for what would follow. To the north of Gunungap lay Niflheim, the world of mist, a realm of darkness and freezing cold that the tradition places in the northern reaches of the primordial cosmos. Niflheim was not empty. At its interior lived the great spring Hvergelmir, and from Hvergelmir, moving outward in all directions through the dark, flowed the primordial rivers the tradition calls the Elivagar. The name means something like icy waves, and it suits them. The oldest sources, both in the Prose Edda and in the Eddic poem Vafthrudnismal, preserve lists of these rivers, some enumerations reaching as many as 11 names, Svöl, Gunthra, Fjorm, and Fimbultul among them, each river moving outward from the warmth of the spring, and gradually, as the warmth fell behind them, and the cold of the northern void closed in, beginning to harden. What the rivers carried was not ordinary water. The tradition holds that they bore a substance called eider, a venom-laden fluid that began to solidify as the rivers moved away from their source, forming rime as the cold overtook the warmth of Hvergelmir's water. The process was slow and continuous. The rime built upon itself, the way frost builds on a window pane through a long winter night, each new deposit settling over the last, thickening without sound, accumulating over a span of time so large that the word long does not begin to describe it. There was no one to observe it happening. There was nothing in the northern void except the rivers and the cold, and the growing weight of ice, and the darkness that covered all of it with the particular completeness that belongs only to places where no light has ever existed. The spring Hvergelmir sat at the center of this. It would be wrong to imagine it as a small thing. The tradition does not describe it in terms of scale, but the rivers that flowed from it were 11, and they were wide, and they moved outward across the whole extent of Niflheim, and the spring that fed them must be understood as commensurate with what it produced. In the dark interior of the world of mist, Hvergelmir bubbled steadily, its water moving outward in channels that widened as they traveled and slowed as the cold increased, the warmth at their surface dissipating gradually as they carried their venom-heavy water farther from their origin. There is something in this image that is worth holding for a moment, the spring generating its rivers in total darkness, with no sky above it and no earth below it in any finished sense, simply pouring outward into the primordial cold as it had always been doing, as it would continue to do until the conditions of the cosmos changed around it. From the south, from the other extreme of the gap, the realm of Muspelheim sent its heat northward into the void. The Prose Edda describes Muspelheim as a world of blazing heat, positioned at the southern reach of the primordial cosmos, a realm of fire and brightness that existed before any other world was made. At its boundary stood the figure of Surtur, a fire giant armed with a flaming sword, described by Snorri as the guardian of this southern world. Surtur is a figure whose presence at the edge of Muspelheim is noted in the tradition, without extensive elaboration in this context. He stands at the border, the sword burning, the heat of the realm he keeps radiating northward into the gap. That heat did not remain contained. Sparks and glowing embers drifted northward out of Muspelheim into the darkness of the void, moving through the cold with the slow, wandering quality of things carried on a thermal current rather than directed. They traced brief paths, small arcs of orange and amber light marking their passage through the darkness before the cold took them, and they went dark against the accumulating ice. A spark does not resist cold. It holds its light for as long as it can, and then it becomes what surrounds it, and the darkness is complete again, as though the light had never been. But heat is not the same as light. Heat persists in what it touches, and the heat that drifted northward from Muspelheim into the void of Ginnungagap was doing something to the air and to the ice that even the darkness of the gap could not undo, warming the middle distance, softening the southern face of what was accumulating in the north, pressing against the cold in the long, slow way that heat always presses against cold when there is no third element to interrupt the exchange. The middle of the gap was neither hot nor cold. The tradition's account makes clear that the region at the center of Ginnungagap occupied a position between the two extremes, where neither extreme was fully present, where the killing cold of Niflheim had not yet asserted its full force, and where the blazing heat of Muspelheim had not yet burned away what the cold had built. Snorri in Gylfaginning describes this middle region as holding the quality of a calm or still place, not a void of the same absolute type as the greater gap, but a zone where conditions were, by the standards of the primordial cosmos, mild. The heat moving northward from Muspelheim encountered the accumulated ice moving southward from Niflheim, and the two found each other in the middle of everything, and the result of their meeting was not fire and not ice, but something between them, the first change that the void had seen since the rivers began to flow. Where the heat from the south met the frozen mass from the north, the ice began to change. The outer surface of the rime shelf, which had been dry and hard and gray, darkened as it absorbed the heat. The texture of the ice shifted from crystalline to wet. Slowly, without announcement, the underside of the accumulation began to soften. The rime that had been building in layers through the long course of whatever served for time in the primordial void began to yield to the heat pressing against it from the south, and from the softening surface the first drops of meltwater formed. They gathered at the lowest points of the rime shelf, where gravity, even in the void, Even before the earth had been made, the tradition implies a kind of orientation, a sense of down, pulled the liquid toward a surface, and then it fell. That single drop of water ticking in the dark against the frozen ground below it was not the only one. Others had been forming. Others were falling in the slow, scattered rhythm of water that has barely begun to move, dripping from the newly softened underside of a rime wall in the middle of a vast and otherwise silent void. The sound was small and multiple and continuous, each drop following the one before it, with the unhurried regularity of a process that has no reason to rush and no external pressure determining its pace. The ice was thawing where the heat had reached it. The meltwater was gathering and falling. The gap, which had held its conditions unchanged for longer than anything in it could measure, was beginning, in this small region, in this middle zone, where the extremes of fire and cold had found each other, to move. The Elivagar are worth returning to here, because they are not simply background detail. The rivers are enumerated with a specificity unusual even in a tradition that tends toward careful naming, Svol first among them, which carries the sense of coolness or chill. Gunthra, after that, whose name holds an older root, suggesting a rushing or driving movement. Then Fjorm and Fimbultul, whose first element suggests something immense or beyond ordinary scale. And others beside these, 11 rivers in total flowing outward from the one spring in the dark interior of Niflheim. The enumeration in Vafthrûdnismal, the Edbeg poem whose title names the giant Vafthrûdnir as the figure whose knowledge of these things is being tested, places the rivers as foundational features of the cosmological system, elements as structural as the realms themselves, moving outward through the dark before any world existed to receive them. The rim they produced was not simple ice. The eider, the venom-laden substance that the rivers carried, gave the rim a particular quality, a density and a weight, and perhaps a kind of potential energy that ordinary frozen water would not have possessed. It accumulated in the northern reaches of the gap in layers that built upon each other, with the silent consistency of geological processes, each new deposit settling over the previous one, the entire accumulated mass growing slowly larger in the cold of the northern void, while the heat from the south moved toward it, from a distance that was also, by ordinary scales, immeasurable. The meeting of these two things, the vast accumulated rime from the north, the steady heat from the south, was the event the tradition places at the origin of everything that followed. Not a divine act, not a decision, not a moment of consciousness choosing to begin, a consequence, a thing that followed necessarily from the conditions that had been in place since before the conditions themselves had a name. Gnongap is sometimes translated simply as void, and the translation is not wrong, but it loses something. The word carries within it the sense of a gap that is charged, a space between things that is defined by the things on either side of it, not simply by the absence of content. The Norse cosmological account does not begin with nothingness in the philosophical sense that later traditions would explore. It begins with extremity. Ice in the north at the limit of what ice can be, fire in the south at the limit of what fire can be, and between them the gap, not empty but suspended, holding the tension between its two defining extremes, the way a string under pressure holds the tension that will allow it, eventually, to produce a sound. The northern rime had been building for a very long time by the point at which the heat from Muspelheim reached it. The rivers flowing from Hervergelmir had been carrying their venom-laden water outward and hardening it into ice through the entire unrecorded duration of the primordial cosmos, and the accumulation was substantial. This is not a thin layer of frost on a window. The scale, the tradition implies, is geological, cosmological, the scale of the void itself, ice accumulated across the full extent of the primordial north over a span of time that had no human measure and no divine observer to record it. Into this accumulation, slowly and from a great distance, the heat of Muspelheim moved northward. The meeting of the two took time. Everything about the primordial conditions of Ginnunga Gap implies a pace that is so far below urgency that the word slow does not capture it. And yet the meeting happened. The heat reached the ice. The ice began to change. There is a quality to the zone of change at the center of the gap that is worth dwelling in before moving forward. The dripping had begun. The rime that had been dry and still and gray for the entire unrecorded history of the primordial cosmos was now wet at its southern face, and the meltwater was moving, and the sound of it, small and specific and continuous, was the only sound in the void. The heat was not overwhelming the ice. The cold was not extinguishing the heat. The two extremes had found the center of the gap and were meeting there in the particular way that fire and cold meet, when they are equally matched, and neither can fully overcome the other. And what they produced in that meeting was not fire and not ice, but water and motion and the beginning of change. The tradition holds that something came from this, that the zone of thawing and dripping in the middle of the gap was not only water and motion, but something else as well, something that the interaction of heat and cold and the particular substance of the accumulated rime made possible in a way that the tradition does not explain, through mechanism, but simply through sequence, first the rivers, then the rime, then the heat, then the melting, and then, from the melting, the first being. Not yet, not in this account, not at this moment. What can be said now, in this place, before that moment arrives, is only that the conditions for it were in place. The gap was charged, the ice was thawing, the meltwater was falling in the dark, in the middle of the void, one drop at a time, into the silence. The rivers are worth naming again, not because they require it, but because the naming itself has a particular quality in this context. The way a name in the dark gives a thing a presence it would otherwise lack. Svol, carrying its sense of coolness. Gunthra, driving and rushing through the dark. Fjorm, whose meaning holds the sense of hurrying, of moving with pressure. Fimbolt Fool, the immense or mighty one, flowing outward with the weight of something that knows itself to be beyond ordinary scale. The tradition preserved their names when it could have preserved only the fact of rivers, and the choice to name them is not an accident. Naming is the first act of making things present. The rivers were named, and the void was named, and the realms on either side were named, and the naming of them is the tradition's way of saying these things were real. They were the conditions in which everything that followed was possible. The frost building on the rime wall in the northern void does not announce itself. Each new layer of ice settles over the previous one without sound, without weight beyond its own very slight weight, without any signal that it is adding itself to the accumulation. Frost builds in the dark the way patience accumulates, incrementally, continuously, without drama, through the simple repetition of the same small process over a period of time long enough that the result becomes substantial. The outer edges of the rivers hardened first, where the warmth of Harvergulmir was furthest behind them, and the cold of the northern void was most completely in charge. The inner channels stayed liquid longer, carrying their eater-laden water forward through tunnels of ice that narrowed as the cold advanced from the outside in. Eventually, far enough from their source, the rivers froze entirely, the last of their warmth given up to the void around them, the liquid in the channels becoming solid from the surface down. The rime accumulated. The heat from Muspelheim moved northward. The sparks arced through the dark and went cold against the ice. The great spring hover Gelmir continued to feed the rivers with no knowledge that what it was pouring into the void would eventually harden and accumulate into a mass large enough to meet, at the center of everything, the heat it had been moving toward since the rivers first began to flow. In the middle of the gap, the meltwater was gathering in small pools on the surface of the ice below the thawing rime wall. The surface of those pools was still. The darkness above them was complete. Cold surrounding them was the cold of a void that extends without limit in every direction except toward the south, where the heat from Muspelheim was still pressing northward, softening the ice, keeping the meltwater liquid in this one small zone at the center of everything. The pools were still and dark. The dripping continued above them. Each new drop struck the surface and sent out a small ring of disturbance that spread to the edges of the pool and faded, and then the surface was still again, and the next drop fell. The tradition that preserved this account was already old when Snorri Sturluson recorded it. The Prose Edda was compiled in the 13th century, but the cosmological framework it describes draws on sources considerably older, the Eddic poems, some of which may preserve traditions reaching back to the early medieval period or before, and behind those poems, the oral traditions of Scandinavian and Germanic peoples for whom these accounts described the actual structure of the cosmos, not as metaphor or literature, but as the way things were. The tradition tells how the world was made. It begins with a void. It begins with cold and fire. It begins with rivers carrying venom into the dark, and with the slow accumulation of rime in the northern regions of the gap, and with the heat from the south moving to meet that accumulation across a distance and a time that no surviving source attempts to measure. Ginnungagap Gap did not have a center in the way that a room has a center. It was not bounded. The tradition does not describe its edges or its dimensions or any quality that would allow a position within it to be precisely defined, but the conditions at the gap's middle were neither extreme fully dominated, where the heat from the south and the cold from the north met in something close to equilibrium, constituted a kind of functional center, in the sense that this was where the conditions necessary for the next event were in place. The ice was thawing here. The meltwater was gathering here. The dripping was happening here. The gap's threshold was here, at the place where the two extremes found each other, and in finding each other produced a third condition that was neither of them. The sound of the dripping. It is worth staying with that sound for a moment, in the way the tradition invites one to stay with it, not by description, but by the very specificity of the setting. There is a spring in the dark pouring outward through 11 channels. There are rivers carrying their venom into the void and hardening as they go. There is a great accumulation of rime building in the north, layer by layer, in silence, over an unrecorded span of time. There is heat moving northward from the south, and at the point where the heat has met the ice and the ice has begun to yield, the first sound the void has ever produced is the sound of water falling from the underside of the rime shelf onto the frozen ground below. A tick, a small, specific, repeated sound in a silence otherwise complete. The void had been charged before this. The gap had held its tension between the two extremes without releasing it. The rime had accumulated, and the heat had moved, and the rivers had frozen, and the sparks had arced through the dark and gone cold, and all of this had happened in silence, in the particular silence that belongs to places where there is not yet any being capable of making a sound. Now there was the dripping. It was not a dramatic sound. It did not echo, because there was nothing for it to echo from, or if there was a surface from which it might have echoed, the distance was too great. It was simply there, the sound of water that had been ice becoming water again, pulled down by whatever served for gravity in the void, falling the small distance from the underside of the rime to the frozen surface below, and making in the moment of its arrival a sound that was the first movement the gap had seen since the rivers began. The sparks from Muspelheim had not made this kind of sound. They were light, not liquid. They moved through the dark on their brief arcs, and then went cold and were absorbed by the ice. And if they made any sound when they arrived, it was too small to distinguish from the silence. But the dripping was different. The dripping was continuous and regular and placed in the exact center of the gap, at the one zone where the conditions had shifted from the primordial equilibrium of cold and ice to something else, something neither cold nor hot, something between, something from which the tradition says the next event followed. The meltwater ran in thin streams from the lowest points of the rime shelf, following whatever contours the ice had formed in its long accumulation, gathering in the small depressions and pools at the base of the wall, and from there spreading outward across the frozen surface of the gap's center in a thin film that was cold but not frozen, moving but barely, finding its level in the way that water always finds its level when given a surface to move across. The zone of thawing was not large. Beyond its edges, in every direction except directly south, the cold reasserted itself and the water froze again at the margins. The zone was bounded. It was a small region of change within a vast and otherwise unchanging void. But it was there, and in the way of the tradition that describes these events, what is there in the void at the right moment, under the right conditions, is sufficient for everything that follows from it. The gap was still. The zone of thawing sat at the center of it, small and specific, the ice darkening at its boundaries where the warmth had reached, and the hard gray of the primordial rime giving way to the deeper, wetter dark of ice that is on the edge of becoming water. The pools at the base of the rime wall held their still surfaces. The dripping continued above them. Heat pressed from the south, and cold held from the north, and the zone between them persisted. This thin region of mild conditions and moving water and small sounds in the silence at the threshold of the gap. Whatever was going to come from this was very close to coming. The rivers in the north had done their work across the long span of the primordial time. The rime had built itself into a mass that the tradition implies without quantifying, enormous, accumulated, the product of 11 rivers over a duration that had no measure. The heat from Muspelheim had moved into the gap with the slow inevitability of fire pressing into cold places, and the accumulated rime had been waiting at the far end of the gap for the heat to find it. And now the heat had found it, and the ice was softening, and the meltwater was running and gathering and dripping into the dark, and the zone at the center of everything was neither frozen nor burning, but something in between, a small, warm, dark region where water moved, and the first sounds in the void had been made, and the conditions the tradition identifies as necessary for the emergence of the first being were in every detail complete. The rime wall dripped. The pools were still. The heat from the south pressed steadily into the cold of the north and held the zone of thawing open, kept it from refreezing, maintained in the center of the gap the one small region of change in an otherwise unchanged and unchanging void. The water was dark. The darkness above it was complete. And at the center of the gap, in this place between fire and ice, where the two extremes of the primordial cosmos had been moving toward each other across the full span of the time before time had a name, The meltwater gathered and dripped and ran in thin, cold streams across the frozen ground, and the void held its silence around all of it, enormous, still, and on the verge of something that nothing in the gap had yet had any way to anticipate. The surface of the rime in Ginnungagap begins to change. Across a small and particular area, where the warmth drifting northward from Muspelheim has been pressing steadily against the accumulated ice, the texture shifts. Dry, hard frost becomes something slightly different. The outer layer darkens. Beneath the darkening, the structure of the ice softens inward by degrees, the rigid crystalline arrangement of the frozen eater, loosening, yielding, releasing the tension it has held since the rivers of Niflheim ran outward and cooled and settled here. No sound accompanies this. The void around it remains as it has always been, enormous, still the distant warmth a presence felt rather than seen. But the ice is changing, and within the change, something is beginning. It is worth holding the image for a moment before moving forward. The rime of Ginnungagap is not ordinary ice. The rivers that produced it, the Elavagar, flowing outward from the great spring Ymir in the heart of Niflheim, carried with them a substance the Norse tradition calls Eitir, a venom-laden matter that hardened as it traveled away from the warmth of its source. Layer upon layer of this material accumulated in the northern reaches of the gap, each deposit settling over the last, the way frost thickens through a long night on a surface left exposed to cold air. What hardened in Ginnungagap was not simply water. It was something charged, something that carried within it the residue of the spring from which it came, and the cold that had stopped it. And so when the heat from the south reaches this particular place in the gap and begins to work on what has accumulated there, it is not melting ordinary matter. It is thawing something that was already strange before it froze. In the account Snorri Sturluson sets down in Gelfaginning, the section of the Prose Edda that records these earliest cosmological events, the process is not initiated by any god. There is no divine craftsman, no deliberate act, no intention behind what occurs. The Norse tradition, at least as Snorri preserves it, gives this moment to physics rather than to will. Cold and heat meet in the middle of the void. The ice that accumulated from the north encounters the warmth drifting from the south. What follows is simply what follows when those two forces occupy the same space. The rime softens, the eater thaws. The frozen matter grows darker and more yielding across the area where the two extremes have found their equilibrium. And out of this process, out of the simple mechanical fact of ice meeting warmth in an empty void, the first being takes shape. His name, in the form the Norse tradition uses for him, is Ymir. The process by which Ymir appears from the thawing rime is not a birth in any conventional sense. There is no womb. There is no act of generation between two existing beings. There is no god who reaches into the ice and pulls a form out of it. What Snorri describes is closer to a kind of spontaneous coalescence, the frozen matter yielding its rigidity, the substance that has accumulated over whatever span of time it has been accumulating, beginning to take a new arrangement, and from that rearrangement, gradually a form becoming distinguishable from the surrounding ice, an outline, a coherence, something that is no longer simply rime, but has become, through the action of warmth on venom-laden frost, the first animated being in the history of the cosmos. He is enormous. This detail belongs to everything the tradition preserves about him, and it is worth sitting with it before moving further. The being who emerges from the thawing rime of Ginnungagap is not a creature of ordinary proportion. He exists at the scale of the void itself, at the scale of the ice fields that produced him, at the scale of a being who will eventually, though not yet, not in this part of the account, provide enough material to build an entire world. His emergence from the rhyme is not the emergence of something small into a large landscape. It is more like the emergence of something from its own background, a figure becoming visible as distinct from the matter it was made of, enormous enough that the process of becoming visible takes time. The meltwater still runs around the edges of his body when he is fully formed. The ice that has yielded to his shape remains at the margins, the boundary between his outline and the surrounding rime, marked by water moving slowly in the dark of the gap. And within that boundary, Ymir breathes. The first breathing that has ever occurred in Ginnungagap. Gap. The chest of the first being rises and falls, and the sound of it, low and slow and entirely without self-consciousness, is the first rhythmic sound the void has contained. He lies still. This is the image the tradition gives, not a being who immediately rises and moves through the gap, not a being who speaks or acts or reaches outward, but a being who, having come into existence, lies in the thawing rime and breathes. The Norse cosmological account has no interest in rushing its first being into action. Ymir exists, and for the present, existence is the full extent of what he does. He is present in the gap, large and newly formed and still, and the ice continues to yield around the edges of his body, and the warmth from the south continues its slow work, and the void surrounds him in all directions. The frost giants, the Hrimthjar, the Rim giants, as the tradition names them, are understood to be his descendants. In Gylfaginning, Snorri identifies Ymir as their ancestor, the figure from whom the entire lineage of giants in the Norse cosmos traces its origin. The Rim giants know this, the tradition preserves it, and among the giants themselves, a different name for this first being survives. Argilmir, Koldroin, Vafthrudnismal records this name set inside a riddling exchange that moves through the deepest cosmological knowledge the Norse tradition can access. Argilmir is the name the giants use for him, and the difference between the two names is itself a small detail worth noticing. The same enormous figure lying in the same dark void, known by two names depending on who is speaking and from which vantage point in the tradition the question is being asked. It is the kind of detail that a tradition accumulates over time, the way rivers accumulate sediment. Different communities, different tellings, different needs, and the names diverge, and both survive, and a careful reader of the sources finds them side by side and understands that this singular figure has been held in memory by more than one lineage of people, each using their own word for the same enormous sleeping form lying in the dark of the primordial void. Now consider the etymology. This requires a small step sideways from the narrative, but only a small one, because what scholars have found, embedded in Ymir's name, turns out to illuminate his nature in a way that the narrative itself confirms. The name Ymir is traced by scholars including Jan de Vries and John Pufel to a Proto-Indo-European root that carries the meaning of twin, or double, or two things occupying a single form, the Avestan Yima, the Vedic Yama. All of these figures, from traditions that are very old and separated by enormous distances of geography and time, trace back to the same ancestral word, the Proto-Indo-European Yima, a reconstruction that points toward a shared mythological inheritance, a story about a first being of doubled nature that was already old when the traditions that preserved it were still forming. What this means for Ymir specifically is that his name carries inside it the idea of a being who contains within himself what ordinarily requires two separate beings: a twinned nature, a doubled form. The first being is already both things at once, already containing the pairing that, in a world that has developed further, is distributed between two distinct individuals. And the narrative of Ymir's body confirms this at the level of event rather than linguistics, because what Snorri records about what happens while Ymir sleeps is precisely this: a body that does not require a partner, a body that generates new life from within itself without any conventional act of procreation. From beneath Ymir's left arm, Snorri writes in Gylfaginning, a male and a female being grew, and from his legs a son was born. 3 new beings from a single sleeping body, and the body itself entirely unaware that this is happening, the giant lying still in the void, while from the surfaces and junctions of his enormous form, small new lives separate themselves and begin to exist independently. The image requires a moment of attention. It is genuinely strange, even within a tradition that is already unusual in many of its details. Ymir is not choosing to create these beings. He is not performing any act. He is simply lying in the thawing rime of Ginnegop, breathing slowly in the dark, and from the warmth or the pressure or the particular vitality of his newly formed body, new life begins to emerge. From the arm, from the legs, small forms becoming distinct from the larger one, not through any drama or struggle or act of will, but with the quiet, unceremonious inevitability of a natural process. In the great still cold of Ginnegop, Ymir's arm rests against the frozen ground. This is the image worth dwelling on. The arm is simply there, enormous, the inner surface of the elbow, or the space between the arm and the body, creating a kind of shelter against the ice, and from within that sheltered space, where the warmth of the giant's own body has had time to work on the cold around it, figures begin to stir. A male figure, a female figure, small against the scale of the body they have emerged from, newly present in the void, existing without anyone having intended for them to exist. The son, born from Ymir's legs, arrives with the same unceremonious quietness. No drama, no announcement. The giant's body simply produces what it produces, the way a spring produces water steadily, without deliberation, as a function of what it is. These new beings settle into the dark of Ginnungagap, alongside the body they came from, and Ymir continues to lie there and breathe, and none of this has required any god, any maker, any external will. The void is simply in the process of becoming more populated through the body of its first inhabitant, without anyone having planned for this to happen. There is something in this that the tradition seems to hold carefully. The Norse cosmological account in Snorri's Gylfaginning, and here it is worth noting that Snorri was a Christian scholar writing in 13th century Iceland, working from older oral and poetic traditions, and doing his best to preserve and organize material from a belief system that was no longer the living religion of his society, does not frame Ymir's generative body as grotesque or as a violation of natural order. It frames it as simply what the first being does. The property of the first being in this tradition is abundance, an involuntary, unconscious abundance, life produced without intent, new forms arriving from the surfaces of an already enormous form. This is not a monster generating monsters. It is the first principle of a cosmos generating from itself the lineages that will eventually populate it. This quality of abundance, without intention, is worth holding alongside the name and its etymology, a doubled form, a being that contains within itself what is ordinarily paired between two. The name and the narrative agree. Ymir is defined by a kind of internal multiplicity, a nature that does not require an outside to complete it, that produces from within its own boundaries the full range of what a pairing would ordinarily produce. His body is, in the most literal sense, both male and female, and the beings born from it reflect this, the male and female from the arm arriving as a pair that his single body has internally generated. The tradition does not dwell on this at length. Snorri records it with the same directness he brings to the other cosmological facts, and then the account moves forward. But the detail persists, and in persisting, it shapes the understanding of the lineage that descends from Ymir. The frost giants, the rime giants who will populate the Norse cosmos as one of its great lineages, sometimes in opposition to the gods, and sometimes in complex relation with them, all trace back to this body, to this arm and these legs, to the first unceremonious generation of new life, from the first being who ever breathed in the void. Ymir himself has no particular relationship with what he has generated. He does not acknowledge the figures born from his arm and his legs. He does not name them or tend to them. The tradition gives him no speech, no awareness of his role as an ancestor, no sense of kinship with the small lives that have separated from his enormous form. He is present in the gap, vast and still, and the beings his body has produced are present near him, and between them there is the proximity of origin rather than anything like a family bond, as later traditions would understand it. They came from him, they are near him. The void contains all of them. This quality of Ymir's, his unawareness, his passivity, his existence at a remove from the consequences of his own body's activity, is consistent throughout everything the tradition records about him. He does not act. He does not make anything, or decide anything, or pursue any purpose. He is the source of things, the first thing, the being from whom consequences flow, without his participation. In later parts of the tradition's account, this passivity will remain constant, though its context will change, for now, in the early darkness of Ginnungagap, with the meltwater still running at the edges of his form, it is simply the quality of the first being, enormous, still, generative, without intention, lying in the void, while the void around him slowly becomes something more than it was before he arrived in it. The rime giants who will claim descent from him use the name Argelmir. It is their word for their ancestor, distinct from the name that other parts of the tradition preserve. Two names for the same figure, and the figure himself indifferent to both, lying in the dark, his chest rising and falling, his body still producing what his body produces, neither aware of being named Ymir, nor aware of being called Ergelmir by the lineage that will descend from him and know him as their own. The gap between the two names is also a gap between two perspectives on the same enormous fact. From outside the frost giant lineage, the first being is Ymir, the twinned, the doubled, the name that carries inside it the inherited etymology of a very old and widely distributed tradition. From inside the frost giant lineage, he is Orgelmir, the name by which their own genealogy begins, the personal ancestor rather than the cosmological principle. Both are accurate, both survive. The tradition is large enough to contain both perspectives on its first being without requiring one to displace the other. A void, a being, and the small figures his body has generated nearby. This is the full content of the scene that the Norse creation account gives to this earliest moment. Ginnungagap is no longer quite empty. It is not yet populated in any meaningful sense. There are very few beings, and the world they will eventually inhabit does not exist yet, and the gods who will make that world have not yet arrived in the account. But the gap has a first being in it now, And from that first being, a lineage is already in the process of beginning. Three new figures resting near the enormous form that produced them without knowing it had done so. The process of emergence from the thawing rime is worth imagining in more detail, because the texture of it is part of what makes it specific rather than merely abstract. The rime of Ginnungagap is not smooth. It has accumulated in layers, the eater of the Elevagar hardening in deposits over whatever span of time preceded the arrival of enough warmth from Muspelheim to begin the thawing. The surface of this accumulated rime is rough and ridged and complex, the way ice tends to be when it has built up rather than been cast. And within this complex structure, as the warmth from the south presses into it, the thawing begins, not all at once, but at different rates in different places, the deeper or more insulated parts holding their rigidity longer than the surface layers. What emerges from this uneven thawing is not a clean form stepping fully formed from a mold. It is something more gradual, more geological, the ice releasing its organization layer by layer, the shape within the ice becoming more distinct as the material around it yields, the outline of the first being appearing the way a shape appears in fog as one approaches it, something first distinguishable, then progressively clearer, then wholly present, the meltwater running at its margins, the surrounding rime still hard and ridged, while the space immediately around the emerging form has softened and pooled. The moment when Ymir is fully present in the gap, rather than still in the process of becoming present, that moment is not marked by any event or any sound. He is simply there, and then he was there, and the void contains him with the same vast indifference it has always contained everything within it. He breathes, the water runs, the warmth from Muspelheim continues its slow work at the edges of the remaining ice, and the first being lies still and does not know that he is the first being, does not know that the void around him will, in the fullness of the account, become something entirely different, shaped and divided by hands that will one day belong to his own descendants. The beings generated from Ymir's arm rest in the cold of the gap. The frost giant sun, born from his legs, rests in the cold of the gap, small against the enormity of the form they came from, present without having been wanted or summoned or planned for. The gap has more lives in it now than it had before the warming came. The account of how that happened is straightforward in Snorri's telling and peculiar in the way that the oldest cosmological ideas tend to be peculiar, not strange, in a way that requires special explanation, but strange in the way that very old and very serious attempts to account for where everything began tend to be strange when held up to ordinary experience. What the tradition is doing with Ymir is reaching back before gods, before intention, before the kind of creation that involves a deliberate maker, deliberating over a deliberate act. It is reaching back to the moment before any of that was available, when the only thing in the void was the accumulated product of two extreme and mindless forces, and asking, what if something simply began? What if life was not the product of divine intention, but the product of the right conditions, the right temperature, the right material, the right pressure of warmth on charged and venom-laden ice? What if the first being was not made, but simply became, the way conditions become weather, the way water becomes ice, the way ice, given enough warmth from the south, becomes water again? This is the question that Ymir's emergence answers, and it answers it by placing the first being firmly in the category of the natural rather than the manufactured. He is not an artifact, he is not a creation. He is an outcome, enormous, still, generative, lying in the void with the meltwater at the edges of his body and the small new lives that his body has produced, resting near him in the dark and the cold. The rime around him continues to yield. The warmth from Muspelheim does not stop. The gap that holds Ymir holds also the small figures born from his arm, the sun born from his legs, the steady work of heat on ice, the water gathering in the hollows of the frozen ground. And somewhere in that slow and occupied stillness, the second process of the Norse creation account is already beginning to unfold alongside the first, another being present in the gap, another form emerging from the primordial conditions, nourishing the first being, and beginning, with patient, repetitive attention, its own quiet work on the frozen material of Ginnungagap. For now, though, the image that remains is Ymir, the name that carries inside it the sound of two things in one, the body that does not need a partner to produce a lineage. The first being in the void, enormous and breathing, and entirely still, surrounded by the results of his own unwitting generativity, the small figures at rest near his arm, the sun near his legs, the melt water tracing the boundaries of his form across the frozen ground. The gap around him is vast and cold and full of the slow work of warming ice, and Yarm lies in the center of it and breathes and does not know any of this, and that unknowing is part of what he is, the first principle of the Norse cosmos, present before knowledge was available, before intention was possible, before anything in the void was old enough to understand what the void contained. The frost giant lineage begins here, in this stillness, in this dark, in this particular intersection of heat and cold, and venom-hardened ice. All the rime giants who will populate the Norse cosmos in the accounts that follow trace their origin back to this body, to this arm, to this moment of unceremonious generation in the dark of Ginnungagap. The name Argelmir is the name they will keep for him, the name of their own beginning, the word that holds the weight of an ancestor who never knew he was one. And the name Ymir, with everything embedded in it, the twin, the doubled, the single form containing the paired nature, that name belongs to the wider account, the cosmological record that will outlast the lineage it describes, and eventually be set down in careful prose by a Christian scholar in Iceland, who thought these stories were worth preserving, who gathered what he could find of them and arranged them into a sequence, and who included this detail: that the first being arose not from divine will, but from the meeting of heat and cold, that he lay in the void and breathed and generated new life without intending to, and that his name meant something very old about being two things at once within a single body. The small figures resting near Ymir in the dark of Ginnungagap do not know what they are yet. They are newly present, newly separate from the enormous form they came from, the cold of the void, the first thing they have known after the warmth of the body that generated them. They will not remain in this state. The account will move forward as accounts do, carrying new beings into the void and setting the processes in motion that will eventually fill Ginnungagap with something more complex and more structured than a first being lying in the ice. But that is not yet. What is present now, in the specific moment this part of the tradition holds, is simpler and in its simplicity more restful than what will come, a great form, a still void. The sound of slow breathing and the sound of meltwater running in the dark. Three small figures, newly separated from the body that produced them, resting in the cold near the vast warmth of their origin. The ice around all of them still yielding, still softening at the margins, the warmth from the south doing its patient work without awareness that it has already done the most consequential thing it will ever do in Ginnungagap. The first being lies there, enormous and at rest, his arm against the frozen ground, the small lives he has made nearby. The void holds all of them. The cold holds all of them. And Ymir breathes, and does not know what he is, and does not know what his body has done, and does not know what will come from all of this. In the long unfolding of the account, he simply lies in the thawing rime and breathes, and the gap around him is quiet, and the warmth and the cold have reached the particular equilibrium that made him possible, and for now that is the full and sufficient fact of the matter. Audumla's tongue moved slowly across the surface of a rime stone in the dark of the void. The sound was small, a wet, deliberate repetition against salt-crusted ice. The same motion returned to again and again in the surrounding stillness, patient in the way that only something very large and very calm can be patient. Nearby, the outline of Ymir's body was just visible in the cold, the enormous form of the first being, lying where the thawed ice had deposited him, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of something that had never done anything but breathe and sleep and be fed. Between the two of them, in that still and enormous darkness, the only sounds were Ymir's breathing and the quiet work of Audhumla's tongue against the stone. This is what the Norse tradition holds of the second figure to emerge from the void. In the section of the Prose Edda that Snorri Sturluson called Gylfaginning, alongside the account of Ymir's appearance from the thawing ice, there is Audhumla, a great cow, enormous as anything that can be called the first or only example of its kind, standing in the gap between the realms of fire and ice, as though she has always been there, which in the logic of the account she very nearly has. She appeared from the same thawing of the primordial rime that produced Ymir, the two of them emerging from the same creative process, the heat from the south meeting the accumulated cold of the northern void, and finding in the place where they met, not emptiness, but the preconditions for a very particular kind of life. From that meeting came the first being, and beside him the great cow who would sustain him. Snorri does not explain the order of their appearance. He does not explain whether Audhumla preceded Ymir or followed him, or whether they came into being at something close enough to the same moment that the question has no meaningful answer. What his account preserves is the relationship rather than the sequence, the dependency established almost immediately, the giant and the cow occupying the same small corner of the void, one asleep and enormous, and the other standing and attentive, the gap continuing in every direction around them. 4 rivers of milk ran from Audhumla's udders. This is what Snorri records, and the image is worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it. 4 steady streams descending to the frozen ground in the total darkness of Gunungagap, the sound of the milk, the only sound in the void beyond Ymir's slow breathing, each stream running out across the ice, and eventually slowing and cooling and going still. In the absence of any other food, in the absence of any other source of nourishment in the entire cosmos, these 4 streams were everything. They were the only sustenance available in a universe that had not yet made anything else. Ymir drank from them, and the tradition does not record that he was aware of doing so, or aware of anything in particular. He was the first being, and he was being fed, and in Snorri's account, this is simply how things were in the earliest moments of the world. What Audmla herself fed on is the detail that opens something stranger and more particular. She licked the rhinestones. In Gylfaginning, Snorri records that the great cow nourished herself by returning again and again to the salt-encrusted surfaces of the ice in the void, her tongue drawing sustenance from the frozen mineral crust of the gap itself. The void fed her, the cold accumulated substance of Ginnungagap, which had been building layer by layer across an enormous span of time, contained within it the salt that Audumla required, and she found it and she returned to it. And the slow, repetitive motion of her work against those stones set something in motion that neither she nor any other being in the void could have anticipated. Over 3 days, according to Snorri's account, Audhumla licked the same rimstone in the same spot in the gap, her tongue wearing away the ice and the salt and the accumulated frost layer by layer, the surface of the stone changing slowly beneath her repeated attention. The number is not incidental. 3 days, the same sacred count that marks and measures many significant events in Norse cosmological tradition, structures this small, patient, repetitive act in the dark of the void, giving it shape, giving it duration, giving it the weight of something that matters. What Audumla did over those 3 days was not hurried. The void had no schedule to keep, and she had no knowledge of what her work was uncovering. She returned to the stone because the stone held salt, and she licked because she was hungry, and she continued because the hunger continued, and underneath all of that plain biological repetition, something extraordinary was slowly coming clear. On the first day, what appeared from beneath Audhumla's tongue was hair. A small area of the rime-stone surface changed character, the ice withdrawing from it, and where the ice had been there was now the dark texture of hair, not frost, not mineral, not anything that belonged to the void, but something organized and biological and formed, resting in the shallow impression that Audhumla's work had opened in the surface of the stone. It was unremarkable in itself, a small patch of hair, dark against white ice, visible for a moment in the still cold of the gap before Audhumla continued her work. But it was the first indication, in an otherwise empty and formless void, that something with a definite shape was hidden inside the frozen matter of Ginnungagap, something that had been there all along, waiting, buried in the rime. The quality of that waiting is not something the tradition explains. Whether the being inside the stone had any awareness of his enclosure, any sense of the cold pressing in around him, any experience of the slow approach of Audhumla's patient work, none of this is recorded because the tradition does not speak to it. What the myth preserves is only what can be observed from the outside: the surface of the stone, the patient cow, the slow revelation of something previously invisible. The interiority of the being inside the rime, whatever it might have been, remains as hidden as he himself was before Audhumla found him. On the second day, more of the stone had given way. Where Audhumla had continued her work through the long dark interval between the first day and the second, the ice had continued its retreat, and now what was visible from the stone's surface was not merely hair, but the shape of a head, the outline of a skull, the curve of a brow, the form that establishes beyond any possible misreading that what is concealed within the rime is not an animal, not a mineral formation, not anything that the void has produced before, but a man, the head of a man, still cold to the touch, still emerging only gradually from the ice that had surrounded him, for whatever length of time it had surrounded him, which is to say for as long as there had been ice in the void, and perhaps considerably longer than that. Audhumla continued. Her own hunger continued, and the salt was there, and the rime stone was there, and the motion of her tongue across its surface was no different on the second day than it had been on the first. She had no plan. She had no awareness of what she was approaching, of the increasingly clear shape of a face becoming visible in the depression left by her work. The thing that was about to be revealed was revealed not because anyone intended it, but because a cow was hungry in the dark of the void, and licked the thing nearest to her that tasted of salt. That is the mechanism the tradition describes. That is the way the divine lineage first came into visibility in the Norse cosmological account, through the ordinary hunger of a great cow, sustained by a frozen void, applied with patient repetition to the same spot for 3 days. The third day brought the complete revelation. By the time Audumla's work had continued through the full span of that final day, the ice around the stone had withdrawn entirely from a shape that was now unmistakably whole. A man, lying in the shallow impression that her work had hollowed from the rime, newly uncovered and still bearing the cold of his enclosure, fully formed from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. Snorri describes him in Gylfaginning as tall, as strong, and as handsome, 3 qualities that carry no surprise, perhaps, for the ancestor of gods, but which nevertheless mark him out clearly from everything else that has appeared so far in the void. Ymir was enormous and formless in the sense that no account dwells on his appearance. Audumla is a cow. This figure, newly uncovered from his stone, is described in terms that belong to human excellence, height, strength, and beauty. The aesthetic vocabulary of a being who belongs to a different order of things than the frost giant who slept nearby. His name was Buri, and with his appearance from the rime stone on the 3rd day of Audumla's work, the tradition introduces a second lineage into the void, not the line of frost giants that Ymir's body had been generating in sleep, but something else, something that will eventually produce a different kind of being entirely, though in this first moment, Buri simply lies in the hollow of his uncovered stone, newly returned to the air of the gap, cold and complete and solitary, in a way that is entirely without parallel. He has no parents. He has no origin beyond the rime stone and the cow who found him within it, and the 3 days she spent uncovering him. The void simply contained him, the way the void had apparently contained everything, not as nothing, but as a kind of frozen potential, waiting for the particular form of attention that would bring it into visibility. The name Audumla, or Audumla, in Old Norse orthography, has been the subject of some careful attention from scholars of the tradition. Rudolf Simic has proposed that the name may be interpreted as something close to hornless cow rich in milk, or alternatively as empty hornless one, both readings turning on the Old Norse elements that compose the name, and both directing attention toward the same set of qualities, not power in any aggressive or martial sense, but abundance of nourishment and a particular kind of presence that is defined by what it gives rather than what it withholds. A hornless cow. A cow defined by what she provides. The name, in either reading Simic proposes, fits her role in the account with the kind of quiet precision that suggests the name was always part of the story rather than attached to it later. She is not a goddess. She is not a monster. She is not aligned with either of the 2 lineages whose representatives she feeds and uncovers in the void. The tradition gives her no speech, no plan, no awareness of the significance of what she does. In Gylfaginning, she is simply there, at the beginning of things, performing the 2 functions that the account requires of her, sustaining the body of the frost giant ancestor and revealing the form of the divine ancestor with the same unhurried continuity. She does not choose between them. She feeds Ymir with her milk, and she uncovers Buri with her tongue, and the void continues around her, and both beings exist because of what she does, and she seems unaware of the weight of any of it. This is one of the genuinely unusual features of the Norse creation account, that its central mediating figure is an animal defined by ordinary biological function. Creation traditions in many parts of the world are populated by beings of enormous deliberate agency, Gods who speak worlds into existence, divine craftsmen who shape matter according to design, ancestors who perform specific acts of will to bring forth specific results. Audhumla does none of these things. She licks a stone because she is hungry. She feeds a giant because she is producing milk, and he is there to drink it. The two lineages of the Norse cosmos, the line of giants and the line of what will become gods, are both dependent on her, and she moves through that dependence without any apparent consciousness of it, patient and enormous, and wholly given over to the logic of her own hunger and her own body's abundance. There is something in this that the tradition seems content to leave unexplained, and the narration is content to leave it unexplained too. The prose Edda does not offer a reason for Audhumla's existence beyond the fact of the creation process that produced both her and Ymir from the same thawing rime. She is not sent. She is not made for the purpose she serves. She arrives alongside Ymir, and she does what she does, and the account moves forward on the basis of what her actions produce without pausing to consider what she herself represents. The interpretation, such as it is left to the images themselves, the milk descending in 4 streams to the ice, the tongue returning to the same salt-encrusted spot day after day, the slow accumulation of revealed form in the hollow of the rhinestone over 3 days. What those images carry, held quietly and without analysis, is something that feels like the logic of patience. Not heroic patience, not the patience of sacrifice or endurance, but the simpler and more ordinary patience of a body doing what it does, hour after hour, in the cold of the void, without any audience except the sleeping giant and the gradually clarifying form of the man in the ice. The tradition preserves this patience with unusual attention to the sequence of days, not simply recording that Audhumla licked the rime stones and Buri appeared, but following the 3-day process, beat by beat, first the hair, then the head, then the whole man. The pacing is deliberate. The tradition seems to want the slow revelation to be felt as slow, to be understood not as an instant of creation, but as an extended process of uncovering, the way a form becomes visible, not all at once, but through the accumulated effect of repeated small actions over time. Ymir, meanwhile, continued what he had been doing since his own appearance from the thawing ice, which was primarily to sleep. Snorri's account in Geralfagynning gives no indication that Ymir was aware of Audhumla's work on the rhinestones, or of the form gradually becoming clear within them, or of the presence of Buri in the void once Buri had been fully revealed. The two beings who will eventually give rise to opposed lineages, the ancestor of frost giants and the ancestor of gods, share the same void, sustained by the same cow, and in this early moment of the tradition's account, there is no opposition between them at all. There is only the cold, and the milk, and the salt, and the slow, patient work of a tongue against ice. The relationship between Audhumla and the rhymestone she worked on over those 3 days is worth pausing with for another moment, because it is the most sustained act of attention that the tradition records in this early period of the cosmos. Ymir generates life, but he does so passively, in sleep, without awareness or intention. Audhumla sustains Ymir, but she does so through the ordinary function of her body, rather than through any deliberate care. Her licking of the rhinestones is different in quality from both of those things. It is not passive and not purely automatic, but it is also not directed by any plan. It is the middle thing, a repeated, patient, focused action applied to the same spot over the same span of time that happens to produce something extraordinary precisely because of where she chose to feed. The frost of those rhinestones had been accumulating since before any living thing existed in the void. Layer by layer, the same gradual process that built the ice fields of Niflheim's outflowing rivers had deposited the mineral crust on those stones, building slowly over whatever enormous span of time preceded Ymir's appearance and Audumla's appearance alongside him. Buri then had been inside that accumulated frost for as long as the frost had been accumulating, which is to say, for as long as the void had been cold, which in the logic of this tradition is effectively the same as saying forever. He had been there all along, in the deep interior of the rime, waiting in the dark for whatever would find him. What found him was hunger. What uncovered him was the simple repetitive motion of a cow's tongue looking for salt. After Buri was fully revealed on the third day, Snorri's account moves forward. It does not linger on the moment of uncovering. It does not record what Buri felt or said or did in the first moments after the ice retreated from around him. It simply notes that he was there, tall and strong and handsome in the hollow of the rhymestone, and then continues with what followed from his existence, the son he would have, the lineage that would extend from him, the figures who would eventually inhabit the world and in some cases make it. And now the account is economical in the way that the oldest narrative sources often are, preserving the significant detail and letting the surrounding silence remain silent. Audumla's own presence in the account fades at this point, quietly and without any particular marking. Snorri does not record what became of her after Buil was revealed from the rime. She does not depart dramatically. She does not die. She does not receive a name or a role in the cosmos that follows. She simply moves to the edge of the account and passes out of it, her work complete in the sense that the two beings whose existence depended on her are now both present and independent. Ymir fed and alive and generating his own lineage in sleep, Buil uncovered and whole, and about to begin a different kind of lineage in waking. Between them in the void, something has been accomplished that neither of them could have accomplished, and the figure who accomplished it is no longer mentioned. The tradition's silence about Audumla's subsequent fate is consistent with her role throughout the account, which is a role defined entirely by what she gives and reveals, rather than by what she receives. She gives milk to Ymir. She gives presents to Buri. She takes nothing, accumulates nothing, and when the giving and revealing are complete, she is simply no longer needed by the story, and the story accordingly moves on without her. Whether this is a feature of how the tradition originally understood her, or a feature of how much of the tradition survived into the sources that Snorri had access to, or some combination of the two, is not something the account addresses. It is simply how she appears, fully present for 3 days at the beginning of the world, and then quietly gone. What remains after her departure, in the still cold of the void, is the arrangement she has produced. Ymir lying enormous in the gap, his body having generated without his knowledge or intention a small group of beings who lie near him in the dark. Bori standing or lying in the hollow of the uncovered rhymestone, the ice receding from the shape of his body, the cold still in his skin from however long his enclosure lasted, the 4 rivers of milk that ran from Audumla's udders now running into an empty void, or slowing, or gone, the account does not specify. The void continuing in every direction around all of them, enormous and cold, and lit in whatever small way the drifting sparks from Muspelheim's distant heat can light it, which is not very much. The 2 lineages of the Norse cosmos, the line that runs through Ymir toward the frost giants, and the line that runs through Buri toward the gods, are both present now in the gap. They have not yet come into any relationship with each other beyond the fact of sharing the same small illuminated space in the surrounding dark. There is no conflict recorded between them in this early moment. There is no opposition. There is simply the enormous sleeping form of the first being and the newly revealed form of the first ancestor of gods, lying in proximity in a void that has so far contained only cold and ice and heat and the two primordial beings that the meeting of those forces produced. The rhymestone from which Buri emerged is no longer mentioned after the third day. It was the vehicle of revelation, and now the revelation is complete, and the stone retreats into the background of the account, along with Audumla, both of them having served their purpose, both present in the tradition only for as long as the story required them to be, and no longer. What they leave behind them is the fact of Buri existing, solitary, handsome, fully formed, with no origin that any source explains beyond the cow and the ice and the 3 patient days. That incompleteness at his origin, the gap in the account where an explanation of how he came to be inside the remstone should be but is not, is one of the places where the tradition's age is most clearly visible. Something was known once, or believed, or told about what Buri was doing inside the frozen stone and how he came to be there. Whatever that knowledge was, it has not survived. What survives is only the image, a man inside ice, and a cow who found him, and 3 days. In Gylfaginning, after Buri is described and his name given, Snorri continues the account with brief efficiency. Buri will have a son. That son will take a wife from the giant lineage. From that union will come figures of considerable significance to the tradition. The account is moving forward, as accounts do, from the moment of origin toward the populated world, from the void toward the cosmos, from the first 2 beings toward the many. Odumla's role in that movement was to make it possible. Without the milk, Ymir would not have been sustained. Without the patient attention to the salt of the rumstones, Buri would have remained inside the ice indefinitely, unrevealed, the divine lineage never emerging into the cold air of the gap. The 4 streams of milk descending in the dark, the tongue returning to the same spot for 3 days. The hair, the head, the whole man, these are the images the tradition preserves from the beginning of the world's second age, after the first being had appeared from the thaw and before the first acts of making had been performed. They are images of patience and of nourishment and of something hidden slowly becoming visible under the sustained application of ordinary attention. They are not dramatic. They do not involve force or will or the kind of violent creative act that some traditions describe at the origin of the cosmos. They involve a cow and salt and ice and time. Buri lay in the hollow of the rhymestone at the end of the 3rd day, the ice smooth and slightly darkened where it curved away from the impression of his body, the void continuing around him in every direction. He was the first of his kind in the void, the first being of that lineage, with no parent who had preceded him and no origin that the tradition's surviving sources are able to describe. The cold of his enclosure was still in him. The rhymestone that had held him for whatever span of time he had been inside it was still around him, its surface worn and retreated where Odumla had worked. Somewhere nearby, Ymir breathed slowly in sleep, enormous and unwitting, the small beings generated by his own body resting around him in the dark. The void held all of them equally, without preference or intention, cold and enormous and still. And somewhere in the surrounding dark, the great cow who had sustained one and revealed the other moved away from the rhymestone, or stood still beside it, or continued in whatever direction the salt of the void drew her next, moving at last beyond the edge of what the account preserves. Buri, stood in the void exactly as Snorri Sturluson describes him, tall and strong and handsome, the ice still visible at his feet, where the slow work of uncovering him had been completed, the shallow impression in the rhinestone still holding the shape of the space his body had occupied for however long it had been frozen there. There was nothing else around him. The gap stretched in every direction, cold and dark and enormously still, and Buri stood in the middle of it without parents, without a past that anyone in the tradition bothered to record, without a single ancestor whose name is preserved in any surviving source. He had simply been there, inside the frozen matter, and then the patient repetition of a cow's tongue over 3 days had made him visible, and now he was standing in the world's first silence, fully formed, looking out at nothing. The strangeness of his situation is worth holding for a moment. Every being in the tradition that follows him has a genealogy, a line of descent, a set of parents whose names can be recited, a position in the great branching web of relations that structures Norse cosmological thought. Buri has none of this. His name appears in Gylfagelling and in a handful of other sources, always as a starting point, never as a destination. No tradition records where he was before Odumla found him. No source speculates on what primordial process deposited him inside the rhinestone in the first place. He is simply the first of a particular line, a man already complete, already adult, already possessed of whatever qualities Snorri attributes to him, standing in the cold void with the sound of dripping water somewhere nearby, and the distant warmth from Muspelheim barely reaching him across the dark. In Gylfaginning, Snorri offers the description briefly and without elaboration. Buri was handsome in appearance. He was great in stature. He was mighty in strength. These 3 qualities, appearance, size, and power, are the qualities that the tradition consistently uses to establish a figure's standing in the Norse cosmological order, and Buri is given all 3 at once, fully and without qualification, before anything else about him is said. There is no narrative of his growing, no account of his learning what he was, or what the void around him contained. He arrived already knowing what he needed to know, or else the tradition did not think his early period worth recording. Either way, the image Snorri leaves is of a man standing alone in Ginnungagap, solid and self-possessed, with the ice at his feet, and the dark in every direction, and the enormous emptiness of the primordial cosmos surrounding him on all sides. What Buri did in that solitude is not described. The Prose Edda simply says that he had a son named Bor, and moves forward from there without offering a path between the one fact and the other. The gap in the account is noticeable, and Snorri does not attempt to conceal it or fill it with invention. No surviving source records how Buri came to exist, what his mother's name was, if he had one, whether Buri's solitude in the void eventually ended in the arrival of another being, or whether Buri emerged from some process the tradition did not preserve or chose not to tell. The narrative simply steps across the distance between Buri's solitary existence and the fact of a son, and the step is made quietly, without apology, the way old stories often leave their structural gaps visible and unfilled because the parts that survived were the parts that mattered, and the rest was not carried forward. Buri is, in this sense, a figure who exists primarily as a connector, the middle term in a genealogical sequence that begins with Buri and ends with 3 sons, whose names have endured through the full extent of the tradition. His own character is not developed in any surviving source. His appearance is not described. His deeds are not recorded separately from those of his sons. What the tradition preserves of Bor is almost entirely positional. He is the son of the first revealed man and the father of the first gods, and between those 2 functions, There is very little else that the surviving record offers. In the great economy of mythological transmission, Bor held the line between two remarkable beings and was himself remembered mainly for having done so. What the tradition preserves in far greater detail is the identity of the woman Bor married, because through her, the entire character of the Norse cosmos is shaped in ways that extend well beyond what a simple genealogy might suggest. Her name was Bestla, and she was the daughter of a giant named Bolthorn, and through her presence in this union, the gods who will shortly act upon the world carry within their bodies a heritage that moves in two directions at once, backward through their father's line toward Bor, standing alone in the rhyme, and backward through their mother's line toward the giant race that first took shape in the warmth and cold of Ginnungagap. Bolthorn is a figure who appears only briefly in the surviving sources, and what appears of him is arresting in its particularity. His name survives most clearly in the Eddic poem Havamal, the sayings of the High One, which is to say the sayings of Odin himself, and it appears there not in any genealogical context, but in a passage where Odin speaks of arcane knowledge and how he came by it. Among the sources of the wisdom Odin claims in that poem, he names the famous son of Bolthorn, Bestla's father, and credits this figure with 9 mighty songs, a body of knowledge transmitted through Bestla's family line, and so through her into the lineage of her sons. The detail is small, but its weight in the tradition is considerable. Bolthorn's line is associated not merely with giant blood, but with giant wisdom, with knowledge of a particular and powerful kind that moves across the boundary between the giant race and the divine. What exactly those 9 songs contained, the tradition does not say. Havamal is a long and varied poem, and Odin's account of his own acquisition of runic knowledge and other forms of wisdom is woven through it in a way that resists easy summary. What survives is the association. Bestla's family knew things. The son of Bolthorn, whoever he was, carried songs of sufficient power that Odin, who by all accounts was not in any shortage of his own arcane resources, thought it worth naming him as a source. Through Bestla, that inheritance passed into the line that would produce the makers of the world, and it sat alongside whatever Bor and Bor contributed from their own side of the family. Appearance, stature, strength, the quality of having been revealed from primordial ice by a cow's patient attention, and from the combination of all of this came 3 sons. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve. The names themselves carry meaning in Old Norse, and the meanings are not accidental. Vili translates generally as will or intention, the directed force of a mind deciding to act on the world. Ve carries the sense of a sacred enclosure, a sanctuary, a space set apart from the ordinary and marked as belonging to the divine. Odin's own name is connected through its root to fury or inspiration, to the specific state of heightened consciousness associated in the tradition with poetry and battle, and the particular knowledge that came from outside ordinary perception. Together, the 3 names suggest something that was perhaps understood in the tradition as a unified capacity distributed across 3 bodies: the sacred ground, the directed intention, and the inspired or frenzied force that moves through both. 3 brothers who share a single inheritance, and between them carry something that no single one of them alone would have possessed in the same form. The 3 brothers standing together in the void would have carried in their appearance the combined weight of both their lineages. From their father's side, they descended from Buri, the man uncovered from the rime stone, fully formed and strong and handsome, with no parents and no history before the cow's attention. From their mother's side, they descended through Bestla and through Bolthorn, and through whatever line ran beyond Bolthorn, further back into the giant race, a line that could be traced in principle all the way to the first beings who emerged from the thawing rime in Ginnungagap when the heat from Muspelheim first reached the accumulated ice of Niflheim's rivers. Both lines were present in the three brothers. Both lines were real and documented in the surviving tradition, and the tradition does not treat this as a contradiction or a source of embarrassment. It is simply what the genealogy contains. John Lindo, among the scholars who have worked most carefully with Norse mythological material, has observed that the double lineage of Odin and his brothers creates a condition that persists throughout the tradition, a structural permeability between the divine and the giant races that no amount of later opposition between them fully resolves. Because the Aesir gods are descended on their mother's side from the giants, the boundary that the tradition sometimes draws between divine and giant is not a clean one. It is a boundary crossed from the very beginning by the act of Bor's marriage to Bestla, and the crossing left its mark in the bodies of the three sons who came from that union, and from those three sons it descended into whatever came after them in the tradition's vast branching genealogy. The gods and the giants share blood in the most literal sense the tradition can mean. They are related in a way that can be traced through names and generations, across the same span of time that divides Buri's solitary vigil in the void from the first moment when a named god stood in the world. Odin's own lineage is the most extensively documented of the three brothers, partly because of his prominence in the tradition, and partly because the poems and prose accounts that survive give most of their attention to him rather than to Vili and Ve, who appear in the creation account and then recede from the surviving record in ways that the scholarly literature has not fully explained. But the giant blood in Odin's line is not a minor detail tucked away in a marginal source. It is stated plainly in Gylfaginning. It is consistent with Odin's own reference to Bestla's family in Havamal, and it helps explain a quality of the tradition that might otherwise seem like inconsistency, the way Odin throughout the myths crosses into giant territory, learns from giants, marries among giants, acquires wisdom from giant women, and in general behaves toward the giant race with a familiarity that reflects at some deep level the fact that their blood was always also his own. The mother's side of this lineage deserves as much attention as it typically receives. Bestla is named as a specific figure, Belthorn's daughter, Bor's wife, mother of three sons whose names the tradition has preserved, and yet her own character is not developed in any surviving source in the way that her sons' characters are. She is present in the account as a genealogical anchor, as the figure whose existence makes the mixed lineage of the gods possible, and as the conduit through which her father's family's wisdom passed into the line of Odin. Beyond these functions, Snorri does not describe her, and neither do the Eddic poems that touch on these events. She appears as a name, a relation, and a fact, and in that limited form she carries a great deal of the tradition's structural weight. What Belthorn himself was like, the tradition does not clearly say. His name appears in Havamal in a context that emphasizes knowledge, the mighty songs that his son possessed and transmitted, and the name itself has been read in various ways, with the element bull sometimes taken to suggest harm or misfortune, and thorn carrying the sense of thorn or point. The combination has led some scholars to read the name as something like Thorn of Misfortune or Baleful Thorn, though the tradition itself does not elaborate on what that name was meant to convey about his character or his history. He sits at the edge of the surviving record as a giant of apparently considerable standing, the grandfather of gods, associated with knowledge that even Odin valued, and beyond those few coordinates, the tradition has not preserved what else there was to say about him. The gap between what the tradition tells and what it withholds is one of the characteristic qualities of Norse mythological material, and it is nowhere more visible than in this genealogical middle ground, the space between Buri's uncovering and the moment when his grandsons first act upon the world. Snorri preserves the bare sequence of names and relations. The Eddic poems contribute a detail here and there. But the texture of those early days, what Bori thought, how Bor met Bestla, what it was like to be the child of a man descended from revealed ice, and a woman descended from the giant lineage that grew in the thawing void. None of that survived in any form that can be read now. What remains is the genealogy, which is itself already extraordinary, a line running from Bori to Bor to three named brothers, each of whom carries in the fact of their existence the combined inheritance of both the earliest revealed man and the earliest giant race. Vili and Ve are, as noted, less present in the surviving tradition than Odin, and this absence has generated some scholarly discussion without generating a clear resolution. They appear alongside Odin in the creation account, acting together as a unit in what Snorri records in Gylfaginning, and they appear in a small number of other contexts in the surviving sources. The scholarly literature has treated them variously as independent divine figures who were prominent in an earlier stratum of the tradition and became overshadowed by Odin's later centrality, as hypostases or aspects of Odin himself distributed across three bodies in a way that the tradition sometimes held together and sometimes distinguished, and as genuine brothers whose independent significance simply was not preserved in the sources that survived the long process of transmission and the disruptions of Christianization. No scholarly consensus has emerged that fully settles the question, and the honest position is that the record does not contain enough to be certain. What is certain is that the tradition holds them together with Odin in the act that follows from their shared lineage. The three brothers are not, in Snorri's account, presented as having different capacities or different roles in the creation. They act as one. Whatever Vili's directed will and Ve's sacred quality and Odin's inspired force contributed individually to the event the tradition describes. They contributed it together, as the sons of Bor and Bestla, as the grandsons of Buri and Belthorn, as beings whose mixed descent from both the divine and giant lineages placed them in a position that no purely divine being and no purely giant being could have occupied. Their double inheritance was not incidental to what they would do. It was, in some sense, that the tradition does not fully articulate, but consistently implies, the specific condition that made them capable of it. The three brothers, standing together in Ginnungagap, carried within them the blood of the man uncovered from the ice and the blood of the giant race that had grown in the same void. On their father's side, that line ran back to Buri, who had no parents and no origin anyone in the tradition recorded, who appeared from the Rime stone already complete, already possessing the qualities that made him the first of whatever he was. On their mother's side, the line ran back through Bestla and Belthorn, through whatever chain of giant generations preceded them, to the first beings that had emerged from the thawing rime, when heat from the south reached the accumulated cold of the north, and produced, in the dark and the wet, and the slowly warming void, the conditions from which life began. Both lines ended in the three brothers. Both lines were present in them simultaneously, and the tradition, which is not always careful about its genealogical consistencies, is remarkably consistent about this one. There is something in that double inheritance that the tradition seems to want the listener to notice, even if it does not state it plainly. The Norse cosmos is not a place made by purely divine beings acting on purely inert or hostile matter. It is a place made by beings who were related, through their own blood, to everything in it, to the giant race that preceded the gods, to the primordial process of thawing ice and emerging forms, to the first breathing body that appeared in the gap when the conditions for life were finally met. When Odin and his brothers later act upon the world, and the tradition records that they do, they act as beings with that specific history in their bodies, that specific weave of lineages in the fact of their existence. They are not outsiders imposing order on a foreign chaos. They are, in some sense, the tradition keeps alive, participants in a process that their own ancestry already made them part of. The image of Buri alone at the edge of the impression left by Audhumla's work is in this light already the beginning of something much more than a single man standing in a void. He is the starting point of a line that will within 3 generations contain within it the conditions for what comes next. His solitary presence in the gap, unexplained and unparented, is the first iteration of a quality that will recur in his grandsons, the quality of being the only thing capable of acting in a situation that no other figure in the tradition is positioned to address. Buri alone in the void. 3 brothers alone in Ginnungagap, descended from ice and giant blood both, carrying between them the named qualities of will, sanctity, and inspired force, surrounded by a primordial cosmos, still waiting for whatever was going to happen to it. The tradition does not dwell on what those early years were like for the brothers, any more than it dwells on what Buri's solitary vigil contained. The surviving sources move quickly through the genealogical sequence, pausing to record the names and relations, and then moving forward to the event those names and relations were building toward. But the names themselves, Buri, Bor, Bestla, Bilthorn, Odin, Vili, Ve, carry between them, when laid out in sequence, the full map of an inheritance that is genuinely mixed, genuinely complex, and genuinely important to understanding what the Norse tradition holds about the nature of the beings who shaped the cosmos. These were not simple figures. They were the accumulated result of several lines converging, the first revealed man, the giant's daughter, the 9 songs carried in a giant family's memory, and 3 generations of whatever qualities those lineages contained when brought together. On their mother's side, through Bestla's father's line, there was wisdom of a particular kind. Songs powerful enough that Odin named their source in a poem otherwise devoted to his own hard-won knowledge, a citation that suggests the tradition understood Belthorn's family as genuinely knowledgeable rather than merely large. On their father's side, through Bor and Buri, there was the quality of having been uncovered from primordial ice, already complete, already adult, already in possession of whatever strength and appearance the tradition considered appropriate for the first of a divine line. Both of these inheritances passed into the 3 brothers, and both were present in the 3 brothers when they stood together for the first time in the void, their lineages converging in their bodies, the mixed nature of their ancestry as plain as their names. The Eddic poem, Havamal, is among the sources that survive, one of the most direct places where this lineage becomes audible rather than merely legible. Odin's reference to the famous son of Bolthorn, Bestla's father, is embedded in a passage of considerable complexity and has been interpreted in multiple ways by scholars working with the text. Some have read the passage as indicating that Odin received 9 songs from this figure, Bestla's brother, in that reading, his own maternal uncle, while others have treated the reference differently. What every reading shares is the acknowledgement that the knowledge Odin invokes in that poem included knowledge that came through his mother's family, through the giant line, through Bolthorn and whoever Bolthorn's son was. The divine wisdom that Odin is associated with throughout the tradition is not purely divine in its origin. It carries within it the contribution of a giant's family, transmitted through a giant's daughter who married the son of the man in the ice, and the tradition is not troubled by this. It states it plainly, in Odin's own voice, in one of the most important poems the Norse tradition produced. 3 generations, then, from the first uncovered man to the 3 brothers who stand at the beginning of what the tradition records as the world's shaping. Buri, alone in the void, the rhinestone hollow beside him, the dripping of meltwater, the only sound in the gap. Bor, his son, connected to Buri by a genealogical fact and disconnected from any further explanation the surviving record might have provided. Bestla, Belthorn's daughter, the giant's child who became the mother of gods, who brought into the line of Buri's descendants the specific inheritance of her father's family's wisdom. And from Bor and Bestla together, 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve, each named for a quality, each carrying in their names and in their blood the full weight of where they came from, each standing in Ginnungagap with the void around them and the mixed inheritance of divine ice and giant wisdom settled in their bodies like a piece of very old knowledge that has not yet found its application. The tradition that produced these names and this genealogy was interested in connection. It was interested in the way things were related, how beings emerged from other beings, how wisdom moved from one generation to the next, how blood carried capacity across the boundary between what was divine and what was giant, and what the difference between those categories actually amounted to in a cosmos where the same creative process in the same primordial void had given rise to both. The genealogy of Odin and his brothers is, in this sense, less a family tree than a map of how everything in the Norse cosmos is related to everything else, how the giant blood and the divine blood flow in the same channels, how the cow's patient work and the rhinestone's hidden contents, and the heat from the south and the cold from the north, all participated in a process that ended 3 generations later with 3 brothers standing in the void together, possessed of 2 lineages and the specific combination of capacities those lineages produced. Buri's ice-covered feet in the impression left by Oddmula's work, Bor's unexplained existence somewhere in the gap between his father's solitude and the fact of 3 sons, Bestla's name carrying her father's line into the divine genealogy, Bolthorn's songs passing through a family connection into the knowledge that Odin would later name in his own poem as part of what he knew, and Odin, Vili and Ve, will and sanctuary and inspired force, standing together with both their ancestral lines visible in the simple fact of who they were. The tradition does not ask the listener to resolve this double inheritance into something simpler. It asks instead the easier and more restful thing to hold both lines at once, to understand that the beings who would act upon the world were genuinely connected to everything in it, that their ancestry included both the divine and the giant, and that the tradition saw no contradiction in this, that from the very beginning, the Norse cosmos was being built by beings who were already, in their own bodies, a kind of meeting place of the forces and lineages that had been present since the Rime rivers first flowed outward from Havargelmir in the dark. The image that remains when the genealogy is laid quietly aside is a simple one: Odin, Vili, and Ve standing in Ginnungagap with both their ancestral lines present in the fact of their existence, the line from Buri and the ice, and the line from Bestla and Bolthorn and the giant wisdom that moved through her family like a current. Both lines were theirs. Both lines were real, and the world that would take shape from what they did next would carry in the very substance of its making the combined inheritance of everything that had come before them: the cold, the warmth, the revealed man in the rhyme stone, the giant's daughter and her father's songs, and the three brothers who stood between all of that and whatever was going to happen next. The blood moved outward through the dark of Ginnungagap, slow and spreading, its surface catching no light because there was no light, filling the lower regions of the void, the way water fills the lower levels of a cave, without urgency, without sound, beyond the soft advance of one edge pressing forward into space that had held only ice and cold air before. Far out across that rising surface, almost too small to locate in the immensity of the gap, a vessel moved. It carried two figures. Everything else that had been alive in the void was gone. This is where the Norse tradition places the hinge of the world. The killing of Ymir by Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, is described in Gylfaginning, Snorri Sturluson's account in the Prose Edda, and the event is referenced in the Eddic poems Vafthrudnismal and Grimnismal. The tradition does not offer this as a catastrophe. It offers it as a beginning. The blood that erased the frost giant lineage from the void of Ginnungagap was also the water from which the seas would be made. The body that fell was also the material from which everything would be shaped. What ended was the precondition for everything that followed. The tradition holds both of these things at once, without strain. Odin speaks of it himself in Grimnismal, the Eddic poem in which the god, disguised and suffering, recites the structure of the world he helped to make. From Ymir's flesh, he declares, the earth was shaped. From the giant's blood, the sea. From his bones, the mountains. From his hair, the trees. From his skull, the sky. The poem does not dwell. It lists, with a kind of flat precision, the inventory of a world made from a body. Each feature of the landscape assigned its origin in the anatomy of the first being, as if the poet wants the correspondence to be understood clearly and without decoration. The earth underfoot, in this tradition, is not an abstraction, it is flesh, cooled, hardened, stretched flat by the hands of three brothers, but flesh beneath the stone and soil, regardless. The blood came first. When Ymir died in the void of Ginnungagap, the blood that poured from the wounds was enormous in volume, as enormous as the body it came from, which was the largest body that had ever existed. The first body, the body from which all other giant bodies had themselves grown during the long, still time before the brothers arrived. Snorri records in Gylfaginning that the frost giants, the Hrimthursar, the rime giants, who had multiplied from Ymir's own sleeping form across the period of the void, were drowned in the flood of blood that followed. It rose through the gap, it covered them. The race that had filled the darkness of Ginnungagap since the earliest thawing of the primordial ice was submerged in the substance of their own ancestor. Only two survived. Only two were on the vessel that rode the surface of the blood as it filled the lower levels of the void, and those two carried forward the possibility of all the frost giants who would exist in the world that was coming. The vessel itself is described in Gylfaginning using the Old Norse word luth, and the tradition leaves that word open to interpretation in ways that have interested scholars for a long time. A boat is one reading, a chest is another, a hollow log. The base or bed of a millstone. The sources do not settle the question, and so the image of Bergelmir, identified by Snorri as Ymir's grandson, the son of Thruthgelmir, who had himself been generated from Ymir's legs, and his wife on their vessel, remains slightly indistinct at the edges, specific enough to be real and inexact enough to shift a little with the light. What the tradition holds clearly is the fact of the survival. Bergelmir and his wife rode the blood flood through the destruction of the void's giant population, and from them the lineage continued. The Eddic poem Vafthrûthnismal names Bergelmir as the point of origin for all subsequent giants, the one who carried the old race through the catastrophe of Ymir's death into the new world that was being assembled from Ymir's remains. The giants who would inhabit the world the brothers made, the ones who would live in Jotunheimr and figure throughout all the mythology that came after, were Bergelmir's descendants. They were carried to their future on the surface of their forefathers' blood. The world was made in a specific order, and the Prose Edda preserves that order in Snorri's prose account. The brothers took the body of Ymir from the void and carried it to the center of Ginnungagap. What happened there was not chaotic, it was methodical. Each part of the body was considered and placed, given a correspondence to some feature of the world they were building, fitted into a structure they were assembling, piece by piece from the materials available to them. There was only one source of materials, there was only the body, and so they worked with what was there. The flesh of Ymir became the earth. This is the correspondence the tradition holds most consistently across its sources. Grimnismal states it plainly, Gylfaginning states it plainly, and the image it produces is enormous, and still, if followed to its conclusion, the flat ground on which every subsequent being would stand, on which the Norse world would unfold across all the mythological time that remained, was the body of the first being pressed and spread and shaped. The soil is his. The dry land that keeps the sea back at its edges is his. When the tradition describes the earth as Midgard, the middle enclosure, the habitable world at the center of the Norse cosmos, it is describing a place made from a body that once breathed and slept and generated life from its own sleeping form. The earth was not made from nothing. It was made from the flesh of the being who was there before anything else had shape. His blood became the seas. This too the tradition states with the same flatness, the same absence of decoration. The water that surrounded the land, the deep salt expanses that marked the outer boundaries of the habitable world, were made from what had poured from Ymir's wounds in Ginnungagap, the sea that the Norse tradition describes as encircling Midgard, the great outer ocean against which the world serpent Jörmungandr would eventually lie coiled, was the blood of the first being, collected and settled into its places by the brothers' hands. The fish moved through it. The ships would cross it. The horizon at the edge of it was the edge of Ymir. The correspondence is total and calm in the way the tradition delivers it, as if the poets who carried this account across the generations found nothing disturbing in the equivalence, found in it, instead, a kind of completeness, a world made so thoroughly from a single source that nothing in it could be said to be foreign to anything else. The mountains rose from his bones. Snorri records this in Gylfaginning, and Odin affirms it in Grimnismal. And the image it produces in the Norse landscape is particular. The ranges that ran through the world, the ridgelines visible from distances, the stone that formed the high places of the land, all of it was the skeleton of Ymir, redistributed and elevated, the internal structure of the first body become the internal structure of the world. Stone is bone in this account. The hardness underfoot when the soil thins and the rock shows through is the hardness of the first being's body. A mountain range observed from a distance, its long form lying against the horizon, holds within it, if the tradition's logic is followed, the shape of the creature it came from, not metaphorically, but literally, in the straightforward accounting of a mythological system that does not distinguish between the poetic and the structural. His teeth and the fragments broken from his bones became the rocks and pebbles. The tradition distributes the body completely. Nothing is wasted. The scree on the slopes of the mountains, the boulders that broke from the ridges and fell to the valleys below, the smaller stones that worked their way to the surface of the soil and were gathered into walls and cairns by every generation that came after. These too were Ymirs, the finer distribution of the same material that had been shaped into ranges and massifs, the smallest pieces of the first body scattered across the surface of the world that was made from the largest pieces. The detail is the tradition's way of accounting for everything, not just the grand features, but the ordinary ones. The pebble in a path is as much a part of this account as the mountain it was once attached to. His hair became the trees, the forests that filled Midgard, the great stands of timber that covered the Norse world's hills and valleys, were in this account a different distribution of the same material. The hair of the first being, grown out and rooted, and alive in the way hair is alive, covering the surface of the flesh earth, the way hair covers a body. The parallel is precise. Skin and hair, flesh and covering, earth and forest. The body's structure becomes the world's structure through a series of correspondences that are not approximate but exact, and not poetic reaches, but the tradition's literal account of what was done with the body of Ymir in the void of Ginnungagap. After Odin and his brothers had finished their work, the skull of Ymir became the sky. This is the transformation that opens the widest frame, the one that produces the largest image. The dome of the sky, in the Norse account, is the interior surface of a head. Odin and his brothers lifted it. They placed it above the newly formed earth and set it there, curved overhead, the inside of a skull, looking down at the flesh earth below it, the way the inside of a skull always faces inward, toward what it contains, toward what it shelters. Every being who would ever look up at the sky in this tradition was looking up at Ymir, not at an abstraction, not at an expanse of air that had always been there, at the dome of the first head, placed overhead by the hands of Bor's sons, held up above the world they were assembling from the body of the being they had killed in the gap. Because the skull was the sky, because it was a curved and physical object rather than an infinite expanse, it required support. It needed to be held. The tradition provides for this in a way that is precise and slightly strange, and entirely consistent with the methodical character of the creation account as a whole. Snorri records in Gylfaginning that 4 dwarves were placed at the 4 corners of the sky to hold it up. Their names were Northri, Suthri, Ostri, and Vestri, north, south, east, and west. The names appear in Völuspá as well, the great Eddic poem that opens with the Völva's account of the world's making and ends with its destruction, and their presence in both Snorri's prose and in the older poetry suggests that the image of the 4-direction dwarves bracing the sky was an established feature of the tradition, rather than a detail. Snorri added, 4 figures stationed permanently at the far edges of the world, their bodies carrying the weight of Ymir's skull above them, their names the names of the 4 directions that every subsequent navigation across the surface of the world would use. To say north was to name a dwarf. To orient by the 4 directions was to invoke the 4 figures at the sky's corners, still there, still holding. The brain of Ymir was cast upward into the space beneath the skull. Snorri records this in Gylfaginning as well, and it is among the more unusual correspondences in an account full of unusual correspondences. The clouds that drift across the sky, that gather and reform and release rain on the world below. In the Norse account, these are the brain of the first being, thrown into the air by the brothers and left to move as it has moved ever since. The drift of clouds across an evening sky, their slow reformation, the way they cross the dome overhead without following a fixed course. All of this is the movement of Ymir's thought matter, distributed through the air below his skull, continuing to drift and reform and disperse across the full span of time since the world was first assembled. The detail extends the logic of the creation account into the most immediate features of the sky, not just the dome above, but the moving shapes within it. Not just the bones and flesh and blood of the world's structure, but the material that animated the first head, still moving, still present, still visible on any evening when the clouds are slow and the sky is wide. Snorri's account in Gylfaginning does not pause to comment on the strangeness of what it describes. This is worth attending to. The text moves through the correspondences, flesh to earth, blood to sea, bones to mountains, skull to sky, with the same unhurried factual register that it uses to describe genealogies and structural features of the cosmos. There is no moment in which Snorri steps back to observe how extraordinary the image is, no flourish that draws attention to the singularity of a tradition in which the landscape itself is a transformed body. The Prose Edda simply records what the tradition held to be true about the origin of the world and continues forward. The creation is a fact the text carries, the way all the other facts in it are carried, carefully, in sequence, with attention to the sources it is drawing from and the order in which events occurred. The structure of the world the brothers built from Ymir was not only the features already described. The tradition also records what they did with the sparks and glowing embers that drifted from Muspelheim, the realm of fire at the southern extreme of the primordial cosmos, which had been burning in the distance since before anything else existed. In Gylfaginning, Snorri records that Odin and his brothers took these sparks and embers and placed them in the sky as the stars and other lights that would illuminate the world below. The fire that had existed since the beginning, drifting northward in embers through the dark of the gap, in the constructed world it became fixed. Given positions, directed. The stars were not new materials. They were what had always been burning, collected and placed where they would be useful to the world being assembled beneath them. The heavenly lights, in this account, are older than the sky they occupy. They are older than the skull that holds them. They were burning in the void before Ymir was born, and they are still burning now. The making of Midgarth from Ymir's remains was also the creation of Utgarth, the outer space beyond the habitable world, the region outside the middle enclosure. Snorri records that the brothers used Ymir's eyebrows to construct a defensive boundary around the inner world, a barrier between the habitable region made from Ymir's flesh and the outer regions that would be inhabited by the frost giants who survived the blood flood. Bergelmir and his wife, arriving from their vessel onto whatever ground was available to them, found themselves in the outer reaches of the constructed world, in the region that would become Jotunheim, the home of the giants. The world was built to contain them at a distance. The habitable center was enclosed and bounded, set apart from the giant-inhabited periphery by a barrier made from the body of the giant, whose death had made the center possible. The boundary was Ymir too, even the wall was him. The correspondence between the body of the first being and the structure of the world made from that body extends through every layer of the Norse cosmological account. It does not weaken at the edges. The detail about the eyebrows forming the boundary enclosure is not a supplementary fact added after the central correspondences have been established. It is part of the same logic, the same exhaustive accounting for a body distributed completely into a world. Nothing of Ymir was left over. Nothing was discarded into some remainder pile outside the structure of what was being made. The tradition's creation account is total in this sense. The first body and the world are the same thing in different states, the same material arranged differently, one form preceding and containing all the others that would follow it. This makes the world itself, in the Norse tradition, a kind of extended body, not metaphorically but structurally, in the way the account is built. The mountains are bone, the soil is flesh, the sea is blood, the sky is skull, the clouds are brain, moving, the stars are old fire, placed and fixed, the boundary of the habitable world is brow, the trees are hair, the rocks are teeth. If the inventory is followed to its end, what emerges is a picture of the world as an organism that has been disassembled and reassembled in a new form, still the same substance, still the same origin, but no longer a body sleeping in a void, now a world, the same material, differently arranged, holding within its rocks and soil and seas the original form of the being whose death preceded it. Bergelmir's survival is not an afterthought in this account. The prose Edda places the description of his vessel and his escape within the same narrative passage as the construction of the world from Ymir's body, and the placement is meaningful. The world is being built from a giant's remains at the same moment that the giant's continuation is being secured on a vessel crossing the surface of that giant's blood. The two things happen simultaneously. The ancestor is being made into a world while the descendants are surviving the flood of his death. The tradition does not frame this as ironic. It holds it as a structural fact about the way the world came to be. A world built from death and populated from survival, the two conditions of its origin running in parallel from the beginning. The frost giants who would come after Bergelmir, the ones who inhabited Jotunheim and all the mythological narratives that followed the creation, were therefore a lineage with a peculiar relationship to the landscape around them. The world they moved through was their ancestor. The mountains they crossed were Ymir's bones. The seas they could not cross without aid were Ymir's blood. The sky above them was Ymir's skull. They lived inside the transformed body of the being they came from, in the outer regions of a world constructed from his remains by the sons of Bor, who were themselves, through their mother Bestla and her father Bolthorn, kin to the giant race. The genealogy of the world's makers and the genealogy of the world's giant inhabitants shared a single root in the first body. Everyone who moved through the constructed world moved through something that was, in some sense, their ancestor, the brothers who built it, the giants who survived to inhabit its edges, even the gods who would later come to occupy its center. The scale of what Odin and his brothers did in Ginnungagap is worth following to its natural extent. Before they began, there was a void with two extremes, fire in the south, ice in the north, and in the center of that void, the body of the first being lying where it had fallen. After they finished, there was a world. The flesh of one body had become the ground of an entire cosmos. The bones of one skeleton had become every mountain range that would ever exist. The blood of one body had filled every sea. The skull of one head looked down on everything that lived beneath it. The trees grew from his hair, the rocks were his teeth. The clouds were his thoughts, dispersed into the air, still drifting. The stars were old fire, now fixed above the skull that was the sky, burning in the same places, since the brothers placed them there. The creation account in the Norse tradition is not a story about the world being made from nothing. It is a story about the world being made from something, from the specific physical, enumerated substance of the first being. This is what distinguishes it from accounts of creation ex nihilo, from traditions that describe a god speaking a world into being from empty air, from cosmologies in which the material of the world arrives from somewhere undefined or unspecified. The Norse account specifies. It names the correspondence for each feature. It accounts for the whole body. The world is not like Ymir. The world is Ymir, in a different form, shaped by hands that knew what they were doing and worked through the available material until nothing was left to place. Grimnismal gives Odin's words for this. The poem sets the god in pain, bound between two fires, speaking to a young king who does not yet understand who is addressing him. In that state, suffering disguised, about to reveal himself, Odin describes the world he helped to make with the same plainness the tradition always uses for this account. From Ymir's flesh the earth was made, from his blood the sea, from his bones the mountains, from his hair the trees, from his skull the sky. The list is recited not as a boast and not as a lament, but as a statement of fact offered in a moment of extremity, the kind of thing a being says when stripped of all concealment. Here is what I know, here is what I did, here is the world I made from what was available. The poem does not comment, it gives the list and continues, and the world it describes is the one that has been there ever since. The brothers place the skull of Ymir overhead and station the four dwarves at the corners to hold it. Northri in the north, Suthri in the south, Austri in the east, Vestri in the west, four figures whose names became the names of the directions, who took on the permanent work of holding up the sky from its four corners. The sky did not fall. It does not fall. The dwarves are there. The skull of the first being remains overhead, held in place by four figures whose names are the coordinates every subsequent navigation depends on. This is a practical cosmological arrangement in the tradition's terms, not a dramatic one. The sky needs to be held. The dwarves hold it. The world continues beneath them, habitable and enclosed, bounded by Ymir's brows and roofed by his skull, and floored by his flesh and watered by his blood. Clouds move across the sky on a slow evening, accumulating in the west, crossing the dome of the heavens without haste, thinning at the edges and thickening at the center before reforming into new shapes and drifting on. The Norse account holds that this movement, the drifting and reforming that clouds have done since the world was assembled, is the movement of Ymir's brain, cast upward by the brothers when they placed the skull overhead, still crossing and recrossing the interior of the dome that was once the head it occupied. The clouds are not separate from the sky. They move through. They are part of the same origin. The brain is inside the skull, as it always was, but now the skull is the sky, and the brain is the clouds, and both of them have been in motion since the morning of the world. There is no particular drama in the clouds continuing to drift. There is no event in it, nothing that changes or resolves. It is simply what the tradition records, one of the correspondences between Ymir's body and the world's features, and it continues as correspondences continue, without announcement, without pause, at the same pace it has always moved at. The clouds that cross an evening sky in the Norse world, in the world as the tradition describes it, have been crossing since the first morning of the world's existence. They were there when Bergelmir's vessel came to rest, and he and his wife stepped onto the ground of the outer world. They were there when Buri stood alone in the void after Audhumla moved away. They were there before the stars were placed. They are the oldest moving thing in the sky, the matter of the first mind, dispersed and drifting, reforming in the cold air beneath the dome that was once the skull it was contained in. The world the brothers built from what was left has been the world ever since. Mythgarth there, the middle enclosure, the habitable region bounded by Ymir's brows and roofed by his skull. This is the world that all subsequent Norse mythology unfolds within. The gods who came to inhabit Asgarthur, the divine enclosure within the constructed cosmos, moved through a world made from the body of the being whose blood had destroyed the frost giants, the human beings who would eventually be made and placed in Midgarthur. Snorri's account describes this happening after the construction of the world itself, lived on the flesh of the first being, walked on his skin, drank his blood as it had settled into rivers and seas, looked up at his skull every time they raised their eyes. The world was not something built around them, it was something they were placed inside, a constructed space, assembled from a prior body, still the same substance it had always been, only arranged differently. The tradition does not suggest that this knowledge, that the world is a transformed body, should produce unease in the beings who live within it. The sources that carry this account carry it with the same steadiness they bring to genealogies and geographical descriptions and the names of the dwarves who hold up the sky. It is a fact about the world, offered as other facts about the world are offered, in sequence and without alarm. The earth is flesh, the sea is blood, the sky is skull, the clouds are brain. These are the answers the tradition gives when asked what the world is made of, and they are given with the same matter-of-fact precision that any other structural description would receive. The Prose Edda preserves this account within Gylfaginning, Snorri's framing narrative, in which a Swedish king named Gylfi travels to the hall of the Aesir and asks questions of three figures who answer him in turn. The creation account is one of the answers. It is delivered in response to a question about the origin of the world, and when it is finished, the three figures simply move on to the next answer. There is no pause for reflection on the magnitude of what has just been described. The world was made from Ymir's body. The dwarves hold up the sky. The frost giants live in Jotunheimr. What else do you want to know? The tradition holds its own content, with a kind of equanimity that is one of its most distinctive qualities, an apparent ease with the scale and strangeness of what it describes, as if the poets and scholars who shaped this account had found in it not something alarming, but something simply true, the way the world was, recorded plainly for whoever came after. The body of Ymir persists in the world the brothers made from it, not as a memory, not as a story the world tells about itself, but as the actual substance of the place, the stone in the mountains, the water in the seas, the soil underfoot, the dome overhead, the clouds that reform and drift and thin and thicken in the air beneath the skull. The world is not built on Ymir's remains. The world is Ymir's remains arranged. What breathed in the void of Ginnungagap and generated life from its sleeping form, what lay enormous and still while the meltwater ran around its edges, what Odin and his brothers encountered in the primordial gap. That same substance is here, in a different form, in every mountain and every sea and every slow cloud crossing a darkening sky. It has been here since the morning of the world. It will be here until whatever the tradition holds is coming, has arrived, and the world as it is known has run its full course. The Norse account does not ask the world to be separate from its origin.